There are a few select listeners who help support the World War II podcast, and we've had a few new ones in the last few weeks. I can't thank you all enough. It's great to know you enjoy the podcast. If you would like to support the show and become a patron, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast or check the World War II podcast website for details. Hello, I'm Angus Wallace, and welcome to another World War II podcast. We're once more in the Pacific, looking at what must be the longest dogfight in history of a single B-17 bomber against a swarm of Japanese Zero fighters. If not at 40 minutes, it's certainly one of the longest dogfights of the war. I'm joined by Bob Drury. Bob, along with his co-author Tom Calvin, aren't strangers to the Pacific Theatre, having previously penned Halsey's Typhoon. Their latest book, Lucky 666, follows the crew of a B-17 bomber who volunteered to undertake a solo reconnaissance mission. Even from the outset, it seems like a suicide mission. Before we get to Jane 666, I thought we'd start with the situation in the Pacific at this time. We're looking post-Pearl Harbor, mid-43.
It was a very secondary theater of war, Angus. As you well know, I mean, once Singapore fell and the Japanese Empire stretched, I think it was 1/8 of the Earth's circumference from the India-Burma border up to the Aleutians, and then down through half of New Guinea. But the Allies had come to a Germany first decision. And so the American, and to what extent the Brits were still in India, it was holding pattern. Germany first, we want to take out Germany, then we'll turn all eyes towards the Japanese Empire. And I believe the exact instructions were defend Australia, hold the supply lines, raid when you can. To that effect, all military materiel, men, they were all going east to North Africa at the time. And it was kind of a backwater of a war. And as the Marines were clawing their way across Guadalcanal, the American airmen of it was still the U.S. Army Air Force. There was no U.S. Air Force yet. The American airmen of the U.S. Army Air Force were kind of being funneled into Australia, places like Townsville. And then once Port Moresby on the southern tip of Papua New Guinea was secured, that became the main base, and it became the most important air base in the Southwest Pacific, in the South Pacific. We had Admiral Nimitz east of that, had not yet started his island hopping campaign, and it was a tenuous time. And the Japanese really thought, if we can take Australia and cut off the lifeline to American material, the little American material that was coming to the Southwest Pacific, America might just turn its back altogether, defend its west coast, and Asia is ours. And so it was under these dire circumstances that our heroes, so to speak, arrived in the Southwest Pacific Theater.
The one thing that the airmen had at that time to their advantage was probably George Kenny, who is possibly one of the most undersung commanders of the war. I think he made MacArthur look good. Without him, MacArthur might have been sunk. But what were conditions like for these crews? I mean, they're not all the best equipment, as you say, has been funneled to the European theatre. So what are they flying? Are they getting any spare parts? Or
No, they're not even getting their own maintenance crews. The crews, the air crews themselves, were learning to kind of jerry-rig, to Rube Goldberg any planes. We have one section of the book where we list the Australian Cotexes were made great air filters. There was an Australian sixpence coin that they were using to plug for the ignition magnetos. They were a step above duct tape and rubber bands and glue, but they kept going back up, and in a way that all against us attitude, I think, seemed to help, because when General Kenny came in and took over the 5th Air Force, the Forgotten 5th, they called it, because the mighty 8th Air Force in Britain was getting all the air crews, was getting all the spare parts, was getting all the best pilots, was getting, or what they thought were the best pilots, was getting all the attention, too, in the media. George Kenny was probably the only man who could work with MacArthur. I mean, they offered the job to Jimmy Doolittle, and not only did Doolittle not want to work under MacArthur, who was a bit of an officious prig, MacArthur did not want Jimmy Doolittle as his number two because Doolittle was already famous for the pinprick raid on Tokyo. And I think the United States and I think the Allied war effort kind of lucked into George Kenney. He was a small man, 5'3", 5'4". He had kind of a bulldog lower lip. And he came in and he said to General MacArthur, I'm going to be loyal to you. MacArthur had been feuding with all the other American generals based in Australia. And he said, I'm going to be loyal to you, but I expect you to be loyal to me. I expect you to be loyal to my airmen, who will also be loyal to you. If we can work that out, we will work well together. And MacArthur, with that kind of downturned look you see in all the photos, stands up from his desk, walks around the desk, and Kenney is thinking, okay, it looks like I'm fired. I'm back in San Francisco next week. And MacArthur claps him on the shoulder and said, George, I think we can work together. And it was like the end of Casablanca. It was the beginning of a beautiful relationship.
And he won the respect of his airmen, but the missions they were being asked to run were difficult missions. They were long range, no fighter escorts.
Thousands of miles across uncharted ocean. And at the time, Fortress Singapore, long gone. It is now the Japanese Fortress Rabaul. It was their bastion in the Southwest Pacific. And it was a beautiful harbor, and it was from where they ran all their operations. And to get to Rabaul from Australia, you had to stop over at Port Moresby. Before Port Moresby was secured, they would land at Port Moresby, roll out the aviation fuel, hand pump it, don't even turn the engines off because the Japanese were bombing Port Moresby every day. And then you have another 1,200-mile trip to Rabaul. Rabaul is at the top of the Solomon chain, and it was disorganized, to say the least, for the first 6 months. I mean, before Kenney got there, half the people didn't make it to Rabaul. They didn't get over the Owen Stanley mountain range. When they did get there, they didn't have secondary targets. They were kind of just dropping their bombs anywhere they could. And Kenney turned them into a disciplined force. Now, Rabaul was the most important target, but also there was a strait that ran down between the Solomons and among the Solomons, and the Allies took to calling it the slot. And the Japanese were running all their reinforcements down the slot. And at the time, there was a general, and he had pioneered high-altitude bombing. Well, high-altitude bombing was working beautifully in Europe, where there were munitions plants, where there were aircraft plants and factories. But when you're trying to hit a ship from 25,000 feet, and you don't have the planes to do it, you're going out with 6 planes instead of 26, 6 bombers instead of 26 bombers, the hit rate, the ratio of bombs to targets was so low that Major Bill Ben, one of my favorite characters in the book, other than the crew who flew Lucky 666, he convinced General Kenney, skip bombing is the way to do this. We come in lieu. Well, the British had actually tried. They were the inventors of skip bombing. They had tried it against the Germans in the North Sea, but they judged it too dangerous. So Ben said to Kenney, listen, we have to start skip bombing these ships coming down, these supply ships, these troop ships coming down the slot. And Kenney said, well, what's that? He said, we come in at 100 feet and slow it down to maybe 180 miles an hour. We drop our bombs and they skip across the water, bang, right into the sides of the ship. Kenney was actually on his way to Australia. They stopped over in Fiji, I believe it was. And he said, show me. So Ben commandeered B-26 and took Kenney up with dummy bombs, and they started skip bombing against a reef. Kenney was convinced. He told Ben, take a force from the 43rd Bomb Group, which is the group that our Lucky 666 flight crew belonged to, and I want you to take these planes. I want you to start skip bombing. Boom. The ratio of bombs to target hit tripled within 3 months. Now, there were still some kind of old-timers who said, no, skip bombing, it's a waste of time. High-altitude bombing is the way to go. But Kenney's 43rd Bomb Group was the first to really start putting a dent into the Japanese supply fleets that were spanning out all over the Pacific Ocean. And when this started happening, he wanted more and more skip bombs. Now, of course, it was more dangerous, and that's why the British had stopped doing it against the Germans. but it was the only way to stop the spread of the Japanese Empire. They were spreading like algae across the Pacific, Angus, you know this. And it was like, if this is what we have to do, this is what we have to do. So let's get some crazy pilots and crazy bombardiers and start skip bombing. And that's, they called the 43rd Bomb Group the first. They called themselves the first. They were the first to drop parachute bombs. They were the first to skip bomb. They were the first Americans. The Australians had bombed Rabaul in some old kind of flying boats, but they were the first to bomb Rabaul. They were the first to take out Japanese ships coming down the slot. They were the first to lay mines from the air, and they were the first to get pretty shot up. I mean, they took the most casualties. There were people, and they lived in just horrible conditions. Port Moresby was pretty much of a hellhole. Half the time, 50% of the aircrew was constantly in sick bay with malaria, with beriberi, with jungle rot. The mosquitoes they called it the Port Moresby salute, because you were constantly raising your hand and knock away 6 mosquitoes from your head. And it was very, very primitive. I mean, there was one road out of town that just dead-ended, I think it was 30, 40 miles outside of town, into alligator snake-filled swamp, or a crocodile snake-filled swamp. And the dirt floors in the mess tents, people were constantly sick, but, it was war, and this is what they had to go through. I'll tell you one thing, and it's totally off subject, you didn't ask me about this, but when I research these books, when Tom and I research our books, our point of view is, I like big men in war books as much as anybody. Wellington, Eisenhower, Peter the Great, Patton, Washington. I like that, but we don't write that. We write about kind of ordinary men rising to extraordinary circumstances. And the circumstances at Port Moresby in 1941, 1942, and 1943 could not have been more negatively extraordinary. And when I watch it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, whether it was, Richard Burton in The Longest Day, or Tom Hanks in Saving Private Ryan, and of course, John Wayne and his crew. All these people are 30, 40, 50 years old. These are not the kids. These were kids. These were 19, 20, 21-year-old kids. And I know it's hard to find actors to portray those kind of people of that age. But imagine I have a 19-year-old son. It would be my 19-year-old son who would be the bombardier on one of these flights. And it always amazes me when I see Aldo Ray playing the gunnery sergeant. I'm saying, wait, this guy's 55 years old. He wouldn't be out in the field. So,
well, I suspect that the beauty of the 19-year-old is when you're 19, you do have that idea that you're indestructible, and in such conditions, the attrition rate must have been horrendous. So anybody a bit older might have got somewhat war weary faster.
Well, I tell you what, Angus, when you and I were 35 years old, 40 years old, and somebody told us, listen, you're going on a 1,200-mile suicide run, you might not make it back, I think you and I would say, yeah, right, sure, get somebody else. Whereas a 19-year-old kid say, yes, sir, jump, how high? Where's the wall? I'll run through it for you. So it did have its advantage. Youth did have its advantages for the commanders also.
So we get to our main protagonist, Jay Zima. What's his background? How did he get himself flying?
Jay was a character. Once again, ordinary man rising to extraordinary situation. He was one of those smart kids who didn't do well in school. He was an Eagle Scout, which I think he was one of 6 Eagle Scouts to win the Congressional Medal of Honor during World War II. But he was too smart for his own school. His father recognized this and sent him to a military academy. And when he got to the military academy, and then when he got to MIT to become an engineer, all he wanted to do was fly. He joined the MIT Flight Club. There was a flight club that was kind of left over from a World War I Navy squadron that had been based in Boston. But his eyesight was bad. And so prior to the war, he recognized what was going on. His father had fought in World War I. He said, I want to do my part. He enlisted. He tried to become a Navy pilot. And they said, your eyes are too bad. And he did this crazy experimental eyesight thing, which was since disproven, but somehow it worked for him. And he passed the U.S. Army Air Force flight test. And then wherever he went, whatever flight school he went to, they always saw the leadership qualities in him. But they always said, well, how can I'm not sure how X-rated your podcast is, Angus, so why not just call him a screw-up? He was always screwing up. He was always being punished for, take off, and we want you to make a hard left, and he'd make a hard right just to see if he could do it. And the same thing happened when he got shipped down to the Southwest Pacific. He could not, everybody who flew with him said he was one of the best pilots, but he just could not pass his pilot's flight test.
This was in the Marauders.
Yeah. And he was flying Marauders at first, and he was a co-pilot. And he did these crazy things, and he just got bored being the co-pilot. He fell asleep on one raid over Leh. He was flying with a new pilot who was like, who is this nut? He's flying asleep. There was the Americans down in the Southwest Pacific Theater, they were kind of lax about their uniforms. And MacArthur found out about it, didn't like it, issued an order. Everyone is to wear their flight suit. Everyone has to wear their flight gear up there, no exceptions. And Jay would show up, and he's got his Aussie shorts on, and he carried a World War I helmet and a pair of long socks because it was cold up there. It was cold up there at 30,000 feet. And finally, some of the pilots he flew with went to their commander and said, listen, this guy is bad for morale. You don't see the word screw up and misfit in many magazine and newspaper stories of the time. You do see that in the magazine and newspaper stories we dug up about Jay Zimmer. Screw up. I mean, that was almost a swear word back in 1941, and that's what he was called. But when he got to the 43rd, and they were flying B-17s, the Flying Fortress and Jay Zimmer just seemed to be made for each other. So he went up several times with a pilot named Ken McCullough. And McCullough had been a colorful gambler. He had been a circus flyer, and he taught Jay, everybody thinks these bombers, when these Zeros attack us, that we just got to sit there and take it. I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you how to turn into a Zero and then turn back the other way. Play a little chicken with him and open him up to either your top turret gunner, your bottom turret gunner, your tail gunner. Jay learned, and he liked this. He said, this B-17 fits me well. How am I going to get my own? But he still had the reputation as a misfit and a screw-up, and nobody would give him his own plane. Back in Washington, when he was first in flight school, he had met a bombardier, probably the best bombardier in the Southwest Pacific, named Joe Sarnowski. They became fast friends. Joe was only a sergeant. He was a non-commissioned officer. Jay picked Joe's mind because Joe knew everything there was. Just like most sergeants run the Army, and gunnery sergeants run the Marines, and Jay knew, this is a man whose knowledge I need. And just by coincidence, one day, a pilot was down with malaria. Jay was assigned a recon mission, and the commander said, find a crew. And Joe had just arrived from Townsville in Port Moresby. He said, Joe, why don't you come up with me? And they went up with him, and they just clicked. They just clicked. So Jay and Joe hatched a plan. Listen, we're going to recruit our own crew, guys like us, guys that other people don't want to fly with, but how are we going to get a plane? And one of the guys they recruited, he was a gunner, and he had been a pool shark back in the States. And I mean, Angus, we're talking about, they got a night fighter, they got a pool shark, they got a Jack LaLanne buff for their tail gun. This guy, they called him Pudge Pugh, it was a sarcastic thing because he was so buff he could barely fit through the tailpipe to get back to his station. And they found a plane. And it was at the junkyard at the end of behind the end of the runway. And it had been cannibalized by other crews, which was the case in that case because they weren't getting any spare parts in the Southwest Pacific. And Jay said, we're going to rebuild this plane. He said, the first thing I want you to do, I want you to lose a ton. Lose a ton of stuff we don't need in here. We don't need these extraneous seats. We don't need what they called the piss pipes, which were these lead pipes that they urinated out of. We don't need this. But what we do need is we need more guns. Now, the average B-17 went up with 13 guns. I'd say half and half split between 50 cals and 30 cals. Jay said, we're going to rip out the 30 cals. Instead of one 30 cal in the navigator's compartment and one 30 cal in the nose for the bombardier, we're going to give them two each. We're going to give you 2 each back in the tail. We're going to give you 2 each underneath on top. And they called the plane Old 666 because of its tail number. And Jay didn't even bother painting. You know how you see the front of the bombers in World War II, watch out Tojo and fire from above. He didn't even bother naming his plane. They just called it Old 666. They became the most heavily armed bomber. And definitely in the Southwest Pacific, perhaps in the entire world. They finally passed their flight test, and Jay said, okay, boys, we're going to start volunteering for all these suicide reconnaissance missions. Now, they did take place in bombing runs, regular bombing runs, and that only enhanced their reputation as misfits. At one point, the Old 66 was assigned to bomb. There was a hotel in Rabaul where all the Japanese admirals and brass, they had, of course, sex workers. They had kidnapped from Korea and the Philippines. But there was this one old hotel where they actually brought in geisha girls. And these were the prostitutes that the admirals and higher-ups, the Japanese, would use. And Jay and his crew were assigned to bomb it. They said, maybe we'll catch some admirals in there. And Joe Sarnowski, the bombardier, spent the entire day studying. And finally, and as you well know, when they were on target, the pilot seats controlled the plane to the bombardier. Joe, take over. We're near. Joe starts weaving over Rabaul, and he bombs an ammunition dump. And it was a big ammunition dump, and he should have won a medal for it. They get back, and they're yelled at. You didn't bomb. We wanted you to bomb the hotel. Go back up there again tonight and do it. They went back up there tonight. That night, Joe steered the plane, and they bombed a fuel dump. And he got back, and he just said, I'm not going to bomb any geisha girls. I'm sorry. He was a very religious guy, and he had his rosary out. He said his rosary every night, and they said, okay, fine. And at another point, Old 66 was leading a bombing run over the airport, Japanese-held airport of Lae on the northern New Guinea coast. And they were explicitly told there will be no strafing. Where there's a line of Japanese bombers there. We want them out, but no one is to go below 6,000 feet in strafe. We can't afford to lose any of our bombers to anti-aircraft. So Jay was in first, and when you're flying at night, I didn't know this, I learned this, the first plane in had it rather easy. It was before the searchlights went on. It was before the anti-aircraft crews could scramble to their positions. And so they went in and they dropped their bombs, and they were dropping a thing called daisy cutters, which were timed to explode about 6 feet off the ground and just send a vortex of shrapnel. And they looked behind them, and sure enough, they had lit up like 6 Japanese bombers. They saw the fuel tanks explode, and there was explosions behind them. Now their job next was just to fly out over the ocean and wait for the rest of the 7 B-17s to come in and do the same thing. But Jay was out there, and suddenly Jay's out there, and all the searchlights are going on. And he sees the tracers lighting up the night sky. I remember in one of his diaries, he said it looked like the fireworks display over Boothbay Harbor, Maine, where he grew up. And he said, I can't let these guys go in there like this. So he got underneath every plane, led them in, and strafed out the searchlights. And he took out 4 of the 8 searchlights. He got back. He was reprimanded. He had, in fact, disobeyed orders. He had gone in under 6,000 feet. He was thrown in the brig. It just so happened that there was a newspaper man from one of the wire services at Port Moresby at the time. He writes a story about the hero thrown in the brig. There happened to be a visiting congressman in Australia who reads this story. He hops a flight over to Port Moresby. This is the kind of man we need up there. He gets out of the brig. I mean, the incidents that this crew, the trouble they got into and the way they kind of wiggled out of it it's really what caught our attention. Tom and I, after we had finished the Red Cloud book, The Heart of Everything That Is, we have a list. What should we do? We were actually looking at the story of the Lippensauer horses being rescued by Patton's cavalry. And we were looking at it, maybe following up the Sioux Indian book with an Apache Indian book. But when a Marine friend of mine, 87 years old, I speak to him every 3 weeks, he was on Fox Hill, and you know how the Marines feel about the Army. But anyway, he called me one day and said, Bobby, I just heard something. You should look into this plane. These guys, these fucking guys. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry, Angus, but I'm quoting the Marines. So I'm quoting. He said, what they did sounds like they should have been Marines. And this is how we found out about the story of Lucky 666. And sure enough, we started digging and digging and digging. And Tom, it was like a light bulb went off over our heads. I said, Tom, this is Unbroken meets The Dirty Dozen. This is our kind of story. We got to dig into this. And that's what happened, Angus. And
it makes you wonder if the crew were almost, punch drunk with fatigue to accept, to keep accepting these missions and, to get up to what they were doing. I mean, it is almost, it is going up and beyond any reasonable behaviour.
I think that's probably part of it. But I also think it was, oh, yeah? We have something to prove. You didn't think we were any good. I mean, Johnny Abel, 19 years old. I think he was the highest ranked staff sergeant in the Southwest Pacific. But he was such a good mechanic. They didn't want to let him off the ground. And he wanted to get up in the air. He wanted to get up in the air and say, no, you're too valuable to us. You're too good of an innovator. He was the one, I think, that came up with, hey, women's sanitary napkins make great air filters. And so when Jay Zemer said, Johnny, when I get a plane together, I'm going to keep you in mind. And that's how Pudge Pugh, they said, Pudge, no, you're too big to be the tail gunner. He said, I'll lose weight. I'll do whatever you want me to do. I mean, Willie Vaughn was the knife fighter I had told you about. He had been a navigator on another flight, and they had landed during the invasion near Milne Bay, and they couldn't get back up. They couldn't refuel in time, and they were attacked by a couple hundred Japanese Marines. And they just unclamped the 50 cals, and there was 3 planes, and so they had maybe 30, 50 cals. They got in a circle. They used, it was a 24-hour firefight, Japanese just pouring out of the jungle. They finally emptied their sidearms, and it was hand-to-hand fighting, and Willie Vaughn killed 2 people with his bayonet. He detached his bayonet. And when Jay heard about this, he said, oh, man, 30,000. I need a knife fighter at 30,000 feet. You're my navigator. I mean, this is how it went.
Well, it almost makes the theatre sound some strange, almost like MASH, when they're just, we need a plane, we haven't got a plane, they won't give us a plane, let's just get a plane. And they drag a plane out.
That was one of the, I don't know if you want to call it a drawback or a positive of having been in the Southwest Pacific theaters, where no one was really paying a lot of attention. You couldn't get away with this stuff if you were based in England, if you were based in the European theater. Down there, if you got the job done, it was such a shoestring operation that there was a laxity that was allowed as long as you produce results.
Well, that brings us to really the mission, the mission. They accept a recon mission. I'm quite surprised they're using B-17s for recon missions. It doesn't strike me as being necessarily the best machine for the job.
First of all, as you well know, the B-17 was just such a warhorse. They had to go to Bougainville, which was 600 miles away. By then, Halsey's Marines had taken Guadalcanal, and Operation Cartwheel, which was just getting off the ground. It was a 2-pronged. Halsey's Marines were going to fight their way up the Solomons, ending at Bougainville, which was the island below New Britain, which where Rabaul was, while whatever foot soldiers that MacArthur could scrape together, they were going to plow through the top of New Guinea. Then they were going to have Rabaul and Avice. But the key to the entire operation, to jumping off and retaking the Philippines, and actually, if you want to take it a step further, to ending up on the shores of Japan, was to take out Rabaul. And the key to taking out Rabaul was to capturing Bougainville. Now, Bougainville, the Japanese had 3 fairly strongly defended airfields there, but they weren't quite sure where they were. Halsey was looking at maps on the west coast of the island, Empress Augusta Bay, and he said, I think that's our best landing point. But he was told by Australian coast watchers, cattle farmers, and Australians who had lived in Bougainville and stayed behind. He said, that bay is just laced with so many reefs. Your LSTs are going to get hung up and your Marines are just going to be sitting ducks. And so Halsey said, well, we need to find out where these reefs are. And of course, at the time, they had infrared cameras that could shoot 20 feet below the sea. And they also needed to find out just how heavily defended the west coast of Bougainville was. Nobody knew much about Bougainville. Nobody had bombed it, no allies, knew much about it. And so they put out a call. Actually, Jay heard they were going to put out a call for one volunteer B-17 crew. No fighter escort. It's too far for a fighter to travel round trip. And why waste? It was kind of deemed a suicide mission if they made it back. So why waste more than one B-17? Jay found out about it, went to his crew, told him their chances. I'd say 2 in 10 we make it back, and they all stepped forward and said, let's do it. So they had to wait for weather. And at the time, Joe Sarnowski, the bombardier, he got his orders to go home. He was going to become the chief bombardier instructor back in the States. And he said to Jay, listen, we're not even carrying bombs in this mission. We're lightening the load. You don't need a bombardier, but you do need somebody on that gun up front, because we're going to be on the trip. They passed within 100, 200 miles of 6 Japanese air bases. There was a good chance the Japanese were going to see them coming or see them going. Jay, in one of his diaries, he wrote he had talked to pilots who had been shot down on and lived, but had been shot down on bombing runs after bombing Leh, or after bombing Salamania, or after bombing Rabaul, and at least they had the good fortune is the wrong word. They had the satisfaction of knowing they had dropped their bombs before they got shot down. In this case, Jay not only had to get to Bougainville, but he had to get back with the film, or else the whole mission was a waste of time. So the night before, he gets a call from, he didn't even catch the name, it was somebody from Air Ops, and he said, listen, while you're photographing Bougainville, Buka, which is a tiny little appendage of an island just north of Bougainville, it's just separated by a small strait. And he said, they have a fairly strong airbase on Buka, but we're not sure what's there. Can you photograph that also? And Jay went, hell no. Why don't we just radio the Japanese? If we do Buka, then they're going to know we're there. Why don't we just radio our coordinates so they can send fleets of Zeros up for us? But as it turns out, with no bombs in the belly, and the weather that had held them on the ground for 10 days cleared, and it cleared because there was a strong headwind coming out of the west. They arrived at Bougainville an hour and 20 minutes early. Jay sees the sun coming up over the eastern horizon, but the infrared cameras need more light to shoot. So he gets on his horn to his crew and he says, okay, boys, we can go out over the sea and kind of vector for 40 minutes or so until the sun's right, then we can shoot Bougainville. Or we could do this goddamn Buka run. They wanted Buka. I told them no, should we do it? And as you well know, the military service is not a democracy, but Jay, by this time, he was so tight with his crew that they were more of a team than a crew. And they all said, yes, let's do it. We've done it before, let's do it. So they get over Buka. The intelligence had been there were maybe 8 planes at Buka, 8 Japanese Zeros. They get over Buka, and a shiver runs up Jay's back, and he said he sees close to 30 planes. What he didn't know is that one of the ace Japanese Zero divisions had flown to Buka the previous night, and they were on their way to strafe Halsey's fleet to provide air cover for bombers who were going to bomb Halsey's fleet further down south in the Solomons. He immediately realizes we're in trouble. They barely finished taking the pictures of Buka when his tail gunner informs him, listen, we got, looks like a score of planes coming out. They're coming down the runway. We see that we're screwed. They hadn't even shot Empress Augusta Bay yet with the infrared cameras. Now, in order to keep these infrared cameras, in order for the pictures to be any good, Jay, the pilot, has to keep the plane on a steady flight at 180, 200 miles an hour. He can't vary. If he tips his wings 1 inch, it'll throw the vistas of the photographs off by a mile. So Jay is just a sitting duck. Now, he's got a 20-minute head start on these Zeros coming up from Buka, but he knows they're going to catch him. So he's midway through his Bougainville photography run when his tail gunner says, they're on us, and his top gunner says, they're above us, and his belly gunner says, they're below us. Now, he is thinking, I could cut and run now. I have the photos of Buka. If I make it back, but then they're just going to send another B-17 crew out to get these pictures of Empress Augusta Bay. We're here now. Let's do it. And the result was They were strafed. They were attacked. The front of the old 6.6 was hit with a rocket, blown up. The plane itself, when it landed, I think it was 6 rockets, 187 bullet holes. These guys fought down to almost their last bullet. Jay kept the plane straight.
This is the longest dogfight in a heavy bomber.
The longest dogfight in the history of World War II was 44 minutes. And more planes came up, more Japanese Zeros came up for them out of Bougainville. And they just kept fighting off these planes. And Jay finally, when his photographer said, "Okay, I got it," then he started maneuvering. Then he started diving. Then he started using all the techniques that Ken McCullough, who by now is dead, who had died several months earlier, who had been died in a crazy accident. He hit a kangaroo, hit a wallaby as he was taking off, and his plane exploded. And now he starts using all the techniques that Ken McCullough has taught him. But he's got no radio communication. And a rocket has exploded in the cockpit. He's got no instruments. He's flying by feel. His leg is about to come off. It's about to fall off. He looks down at his leg and he said, "It was a butcher's delight. My knee looked like Canadian bacon. My thigh looked like a raw hamburger." He's bleeding from both hands. And in fact, he notices that his artery was nicked in his wrist. And every time his heart beat, a little pink stream of blood started pooling. It's freezing because the side of his cockpit has been blown off, which actually helped him because it coagulated the blood that was all over him. His co-pilot is leaning forward in his straps. Jay doesn't see any blood, but he doesn't know he's dead. Let's just say that everybody is shot up, and they're just fighting off waves and waves of Zero. And it was his expertise of flying a plane that the Zeros ran out of both fuel and ammunition. But now Jay has a 6-hour flight.
And you missed the other incredible thing. You know, you've gone through all the damage, but what I found was amazing. Their airship supply shot out, so they have no air. So they have to come down. But so's the altimeter. So he's guesstimating how far they have to come down for the right amount of oxygen. Otherwise, they're all going to pass out. I mean, it's such a feat of flying.
Right. Well, their oxygen is gone. Their oxygen, in fact, Johnny Abel up in the top turret's been shot in the legs. And so he falls down, and luckily he was shot in the legs because he falls down and he looks behind the cockpit and he sees that their oxygen supply is on fire because it's been shot out. So he starts putting it out with his bare hands, and his hands are burning up. So now all they have left is they each carry a little oxygen bottle, as you know. And they're at 25,000 feet, and Jay says, "I got to get below 10,000, but my altimeter's gone." So he just puts it into a dive, and he screams into this rivet-busting dive. And he's guessing by the sound of the engines where he is, and he levels off at about 6,000 feet, takes a deep breath, and it's nothing but pain because he's got 186 pieces of shrapnel, I think it was, in his body, including most of the instruments that have been blown off. They're all embedded in him. He takes a deep breath, and it's nothing but a searing pain, but at least he can breathe. But the Japanese they're coming down after him. And so for I'd say that was 22 minutes, another 22 minutes he's fighting off the Japanese. And they finally okay, they're turning back. And he's like, "Okay, if we have to ditch, but I got the camera. I got the pictures. We can't ditch with the pictures because they're just going to have to send somebody else up through the same hell we just went through." So Willie Vaughn, his radio operator, stumbles into Willie's got a bullet in his neck. He stumbles into the cockpit and he says, "We're not going to make Port Moresby. We're never going to make it over the Owen Stanley Mountains." He says, "Where's next?" He says, "Well, let's try for Dobador." And Willie shoots an azimuth. None of his radio is working, but he's got an old Morse code tap 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 thing. And finally, he gets a hold of an Australian Coast Watcher and a U.S. destroyer picked them up. They triangulate their position, and they shoot back to Willie through Morse code. Here's true west or true north. You got to stay on this flight pattern. So Jay just puts it on. Now Jay by now realizes he's losing consciousness from loss of blood, and as it turns out, he lost I think it was a third of the blood in his body. And Johnny Abel, who's got the bullets in both legs, who always wanted to fly, And by now, the co-pilot has woke up, and no bullets. The co-pilot, he just got a giant lump on the back of his head, but he's helping to bandage up the wounded. So Johnny Abel gets in the co-pilot seat, and Jay kind of won't get out of his seat. They're trying to. The crew's convincing Jay, "You got to come back. We got to patch you up." He says, "I'm not leaving the seat till we're back." But Johnny, I'll tell you what to do. You got to put it on this heading, 44 degrees true north, and just keep it there. If you hit a wind gust, if you need to turn a little bit, our aerolators are gone, but you can slow the power in one engine and that'll make it turn this way, slow the power in the other engine. So sure enough, Johnny Abel gets it back within sight of land. As they fly over a PT boat base that they all recognize, they know Doobrador is only another 20 minutes. They have no time and they have no gas. They have no aviation fuel left to make a pass to see which way the wind is blowing. So he said, "We're just going to go down." Jay is now, he's in a fuzzy, liminal state between consciousness and unconsciousness.
How long had he been flying back at this point?
It was 6 hours. It was 6 hours, and the co-pilot gets in, and the runway at Dobadora was much shorter than at Port Moresby, and they have no. They can't put the flaps down. They basically have no brakes. And so he takes it down. And do you know what a luffbury is? He pulls a luffbury. That's when they were just getting to the end. It was a dirt and grass airstrip. He gets to the very end, and they're still going too fast. So he yanks the wheel hard left, digs the left wing into the ground, and catches air with the right wing. And you spill it, and you spin the aircraft around that way, and that's what stops it. It was invented by Raoul Luffbury, the French-American ace from World War I. They pull a Luffbury. You know, the meat wagon guys are coming out. The corpsmen are coming out. Jay, who's, once again, he's almost semi-conscious, drifting into unconsciousness. He hears somebody say, "Get the pilot last, he's dead." He wants to yell, "The hell I am, you bastard," but he just doesn't have the energy. Joe Sarnowski's in the front. Joe Sarnowski has down 3 zeros. Jay can, because all the area in front of him has been blown away, he can see Joe slumped over his 50 cal. He could feel the oil. He could hear the sizzle of the oil leaking out. So the plane's going to blow at any moment. And the end result was it was the only flight in the history of, once again, it was the U.S. Army Air Force, but it was the only flight in the history of the U.S. Army Air Force or the Army Air Force where 2 crewmen on the same flight won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, one of them won it posthumously, which means he died on that flight. And one of them was spent years in the hospital. And if you want to know who was who and who won what and who died, well, you're going to have to read the damn book.
and it's a great read. And the image of that B-17 just being swarmed by and it was swarmed. I mean, there's 20 some zeros on this thing for
44 minutes. They were like gnats. They were like,
what a thing to be able to view. If you could view it from the ground, must have been an incredible sight. You must have been holding your breath thinking, any minute now, that thing's going to buy you.
We were lucky enough to, maybe lucky is the wrong word. We were good enough that we found the Japanese after action report of that dogfight and had it translated. It actually was a grandnephew of Joe Sarnowski who had it translated for us. And when the division at Buka, which included 3 Japanese aces, when they first saw this lone B-17 just droning overhead, not changing course, they saw there was cloud cover to the west. This B-17 is not running for the clouds, and it's keeping a steady speed, so they knew it was taking photographs. The Japanese, it was almost like a cartoon villain. They were like rubbing their hands together, like, oh, we got one here. And it was the height. If a Japanese, of course, any American bomber was a coup. But if they could take down a B-17, a flying fortress, the Japanese called it a Boeing. And when they saw a Boeing, their mouths just started watering. And when they saw this lone Boeing just cruising overhead, not changing speed, not doing any, not taking any maneuvers, not running for the clouds, they were like, oh, look at this. The emperor has sent us a gift. And it very nearly turned out that way.
Absolutely incredible. It is, as you say, a fabulous story.
Like I said, Angus, in the very beginning, ordinary men rising to extraordinary circumstances. I mean, I just can't imagine it.
No, indeed. Thanks, Bob. Lucky 666 is available now. I'll put a link on the website. That's www.podcast.com. Don't forget, you can also find me on Facebook. Please give me a like. I regularly post things there which support the current episode of the show, and it's always nice to hear your comments. Finally, it's patreon.com/WW2podcast to toss a shekel, if you have one spare, each month into my virtual tip jar. Well, that's it for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.